Howdy folks, hope you've all had a good weekend and welcome back to Mingles with Jingles. Probably not going to be quite as long as last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, but well, you never know. We'll see where things take us. So, I suppose the big news this week continues to be YouTube and COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. I went over some of the details in last week's Mingles with Jingles, but I'm going to summarise them again here because there's actually more to it than I first realised. So, what is COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act? This is an act that was voted into law by the US Congress in 1998, and it was designed, as the name would suggest, to protect the privacy of children online, and I don't think anybody's trying to argue that COPPA is a bad thing. The original intent of COPPA, amongst other things, was to prevent children from being targeted by online sexual predators. This is not a bad thing. In 2011, however, the Federal Trade Commission, who had been given the mandate to enforce the COPPA regulations, decided that they wanted to expand the definition of what it actually meant to collect data from children. And as a result of these changes, COPPA was expanded to also cover the collection of tracking data cookies with children's information on them. The kind of thing that advertisers use to hit people with targeted advertising. Cookies that track your browsing and spending habits so that adverts can be directed towards you that are more likely that you're actually going to be interested in them. This kind of targeted advertising is the bread and butter of online advertising, and it's also the bread and butter of YouTube's revenue stream. YouTube, however, thought that it was covered. Actually, let me rephrase that. YouTube probably knew that it actually wasn't really covered, but it had done enough to be able to argue in court that it had complied with the spirit of the COPPA regulations, because in 2015, YouTube released the YouTube Kids app, which was specifically designed for children aged 12 and under. The problem for YouTube was that YouTube Kids is basically pretty shit. It does an appallingly bad job of filtering out age-inappropriate content. A significantly bigger problem for YouTube is that the Federal Trade Commission aren't fucking stupid. They could see just as well as anybody who's used the YouTube Kids app that it's dog shit and it didn't do what it was supposed to do. And so in September of this year, just a couple of months ago, the Federal Trade Commission fined YouTube $170 million for failing to comply with the provisions of the COPPA Act. And YouTube absolutely deserved this. I've heard a lot of people saying that none of what's happening with the COPPA provisions are YouTube's fault. No, they absolutely are YouTube's fault. YouTube gathered information, despite the fact that it was illegal, from children aged 12 and under. YouTube has marketed itself as children's entertainment, and they have used the data that they've collected to sell targeted adverts to children, all of which is specifically illegal under the terms of the COPPA Act, and has been since I think at least 2016. As a result of this massive fine imposed by the Federal Trade Commission, and only as a result of the massive fine, not because YouTube suddenly grew a conscience, suddenly YouTube started taking COPPA seriously, and very quickly started to implement a whole bunch of measures to ensure that both it and all of its content creators remained compliant with the COPPA Act. These measures have to be in place by the 1st of January 2020, otherwise YouTube gets fined again. And obviously with the 1st of January 2020 being less than a month and a half away, YouTube got the ball rolling early. As of now, every time you upload fresh content to YouTube, at some point during that video upload process, you are required to state whether or not your video is aimed at children. In addition to this, YouTube has also created yet another algorithm that will check through videos both during and after the upload process in order to determine whether or not that video is actually aimed at children, whether or not it is children-friendly content, regardless of what choice the uploader made during the upload process. If your video is determined to be aimed towards children, or if you have clicked the yes, this video is aimed towards children button during the upload, then a number of things are going to happen to that video. First and foremost, there will be no targeted advertising delivered on that video. I don't actually really have so much of a problem with this. I mean, it's easy for me to say this because I don't do videos targeted towards children. But for those people who have been doing child-friendly content, the fact that targeted advertising will not be run on those videos means that they can kiss goodbye to anything up to 90% of their advertising revenue. Again, I don't have such a huge problem with this, because you shouldn't be targeting advertising to children in the first place, but that's not the only thing that happens to the video. From here on in, I need to give a shout out to another YouTube channel called Folding Ideas, and it was while watching his video on this very subject, and I'll put a link to it down below in the video description, because he does a very, very good job of explaining the details and covers things in much, much greater depth than I am in this episode of Mingles with Jingles. So I do encourage you to go and check his video out, because I learned a lot from him. But back on topic, one of the things, or several of the other things that are going to happen to a video that's marked as for kids, including no targeted advertising, you will not be able to give a like or a dislike to a video marked as for kids. You will not be able to leave a comment. You will not be able to share the video. You won't be able to subscribe to the channel that put the video up, and you won't be able to add that video to a playlist. So what this has effectively done has overnight killed off independent children's entertainment on YouTube. And I use the word independent there deliberately, because all of these things, rating a video, commenting on a video, sharing, subscribing, adding it to watch lists and playlists, these are the things that drive engagement on YouTube. And engagement is a critical factor when it comes to YouTube deciding what it's going to recommend to you next in your watch list. If your videos typically generate low engagement, if nobody hits the like button, if nobody leaves a comment, if nobody shares, if you don't have many subscribers, then YouTube isn't likely to recommend you to other people. And if you have a child-friendly video or a child-friendly channel, YouTube has just switched off. 80% of all of the things that people can do with your video that drive engagement. So not only are you losing the targeting advertising and up to 90% of your revenue, but nobody's watching your videos anymore. Because they can't find them, because they can't subscribe. So you're fucked. You are completely and totally fucked if you create children's content on YouTube and you rely on it for a living. Which is why I say independent children's content creators are screwed. Of course, Disney, Nickelodeon, Hasbro, Mattel, all of the big children's entertainment channels and the children's toy manufacturers, they're all pretty much fine. I mean, it's not like Nickelodeon, Disney or Hasbro are going to go under overnight because they can no longer serve targeted advertising on their YouTube channels. I'm sure they would much rather still be able to do it, but the fact that they no longer can doesn't really matter to them, because the videos that they put out on their YouTube channels are the advertising. So as far as the big children's entertainment companies with a YouTube presence are concerned, it's really pretty much business as usual. The only people who are really getting fucked by this are the independent content creators, just like always. Well, okay, Jingles, so this is pretty much the end of the world, even worse than the apocalypse for anybody who does family-friendly or children-oriented content on YouTube. Why are you getting your knickers in a twist about it? Why should anybody else care? Well, to a degree, you're absolutely correct, because this is not a children's YouTube channel. Based on the sheer number of times I've said fuck in this video alone, that should be pretty obvious. But my content isn't directed towards children, and my audience overwhelmingly are not children. They're not even particularly young. The single biggest demographic on this YouTube channel are aged between 25 and 34 years old. Nearly 33% of you fall into that category. 30% of you are anything between 18 and 24 years old. 17% of you are aged between 35 and 44, and almost 10% of you are in your 50s. In fact, the single smallest audience demographic on my YouTube channel are people aged between 13 and 17, who account for only 3.2% of my audience. This is not a children's YouTube channel, never has been. But that doesn't mean I'm safe. And I'm not safe, and neither are any of the YouTube channels that you guys watch, because of something that YouTube themselves have done once again. Remember I said that there were two things that YouTube have done to ensure compliance with the COPPA regulations. First, every time anybody uploads a video to YouTube, they have to state during the upload process whether or not the video is aimed towards children. But YouTube have also implemented an algorithm to detect videos that are aimed towards children, even if during the upload process the content creator specified that the video was not aimed towards children. Now, you might think that this is YouTube doing due diligence and ensuring that people who are doing content directed towards children can't just lie and have their video serve targeted advertising. You'd think that, but you're probably wrong. And the reason I say that you're probably wrong, and again, I have to give a shout out to the YouTube channel Folding Ideas, link in the video description, for bringing this to my attention, was that YouTube didn't have to implement an algorithm at all. The only thing that YouTube were actually required to do to ensure that they complied with federal regulations was put that checkbox in during the video upload process. Is this video, or is this video not, targeted towards children? But they've gone above and beyond the call of duty, and they've also implemented this search and filtering algorithm, and they've done it against the recommendation of the Federal Trade Commission, who suspected that YouTube would try their usual, oh, we'll just put in an algorithm to take care of it defense, and recommended specifically against it. The following statement was issued by Joseph J. Simons and Christine S. Wilson of the Federal Trade Commission during the court case between the FTC and the people of the state of New York versus Google and YouTube on the 4th of September 2019, where they said, YouTube could easily develop a half-hearted measure that would technically comply with the order and give the public a false sense of security. Moreover, such a measure likely would catch in its net channels not directed at children, therefore limiting content to other audiences while the errors are resolved. Is any of this starting to sound vaguely familiar? Oh yes, YouTube's infamous will just throw an algorithm at its solution to every problem they have ever had. The kind of algorithm that in the wake of the adpocalypse were generating dozens, I'm not making this up, dozens of spurious copyright content claims on my videos every day. The algorithms that were marking my and everybody else's videos as not suitable for most advertisers. And not bothering to tell us why. I mean, it's not like, well, we could appeal the process, but since we didn't know what did and didn't make a video not suitable for most advertisers, because only YouTube knew, and of course they weren't telling people like us, how could we appeal it? If we didn't know what we'd done that was wrong, how could we appeal against YouTube's decision and say, no, we didn't do that because we didn't know what it was that we hadn't done? So all we could really do was lodge an appeal and kind of cross our fingers and hope. And then if we were lucky, within 4 days, if we were unlucky, anything between 1 and 2 weeks later, our appeal would either be upheld and the video would receive full monetization, or it wouldn't. And it wouldn't receive full monetization, but it didn't matter, because at that point the video had already received all of the views it was ever going to get. Most of my videos receive 80 to 90% of their views in the first 2 days. If the video gets flagged on release and it takes 4 days minimum to get an appeal reviewed, I may as well not bother appealing, as it doesn't make any difference. So the two things that were fucking us during the adpocalypse, and which led to the closure of so many previously successful YouTube channels, were that we didn't know what we were doing wrong because YouTube were keeping it a secret, and it was taking so long to get appeals reviewed and upheld that it didn't make any difference to the process anyway, because the damage had already been done by the time YouTube could be bothered to review each individual case. Now, I survived the adpocalypse, obviously I'm still here, but I only just survived the adpocalypse. And I was forced to look long and hard at other options, like Patreon, for example, thank you very much indeed, and now video sponsorships. I'll come back to those two subjects later on, because they're also relevant. But once again, even though I am clearly not uploading videos or any kind of content targeted towards children, They're just not my audience. They never have been. The fact that we're relying on one of YouTube's infamous algorithms to determine whether or not I'm telling the truth when I say that my content isn't directed towards children. The idea that, once again, my future and the future of probably most of the YouTube channels that you guys watch on a regular basis once again lies in the hands of one of YouTube's shitty fucking algorithms. Algorithms, by the way, that the Federal Trade Commission recommended against and didn't want, but which YouTube went ahead and implemented anyway. This is the algorithm that once again holds the keys to the kingdom. And that does not inspire me with confidence. I'm not worried about the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that you end up going to court and fined $42,000 by the Federal Trade Commission because you did produce content that was directed towards children. You lied about it during the upload process. YouTube's algorithms sniffed it out, or for whatever reason you were exposed, and the Federal Trade Commission took you to court and fined you $42,000 per video. I'm not worried about that. And I'm not worried about that for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I don't create content that's directed towards children. Anybody watching any of my videos can quite clearly see that. And I'm not going to be fined $42,000 just because YouTube's algorithm said so. Things would have to go to court. And they would never go to court because this is not children's content. So I'm fine where that's concerned. And all of the YouTubers who are panicking about that, guys, relax. You are also fine where that's concerned, unless you are creating content that's deliberately targeted towards children and are lying about it during the upload process, in which case, tough shit, you'll get what you deserve. But most of us aren't, so most of us don't have to worry. What does concern me is YouTube's shitty algorithm, deciding, for whatever vague and arbitrary reasons, which YouTube aren't sharing with anybody, that something that I have uploaded is content directed towards children, even if it clearly fucking isn't. And oh look, it's the adpocalypse all over again, except this time worse. I never thought I would see the day where YouTube did something that was worse than the adpocalypse. Because whereas if a video was flagged as not being suitable for most advertisers under the adpocalypse algorithm, all that happened was you lost a load of advertising revenue. I mean, I say all, but for several months when the adpocalypse happened, I was basically working for free. So yeah, it's not a minor thing, but you could still like the videos, you could still share the videos, you could still leave your comments on the videos. But that's not going to happen if your video is flagged as content for children. All of that shit is gone. And of course, while I'm sitting waiting for the review process to uphold my appeal, nobody's earning any money on that video, least of which me. And by the time the review realizes that, oh, guess what? You won't believe this, our bot fucked up. It's too late. The video's received all of the views it's ever going to have. And all you get from YouTube out of it is, oops, our bad, sorry. In fact, you don't even get the sorry. Oh, YouTube, don't ever change. And they didn't have to do this. That's the important thing here. They didn't have to implement the algorithm. The Federal Trade Commission recommended against it. But they went ahead and did it anyway. Why do you suppose that is? Because if YouTube was even remotely serious about this whole thing, there are two things that they could very easily have done that would make this entire problem go away. First, stop taking money from advertisers who are running adverts that are clearly aimed at children under 13 years of age. Second, despite the fact that you have to state that you're age 13 or over before you're even allowed to create a YouTube account, it turns out that, well, kids lie. Wow, who'd have guessed? I mean, obviously they do, or we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. How about, instead of going after independent content creators, again, YouTube uses its resources and algorithms to identify which of its millions of user accounts have clearly been fraudulently created by children under the age of 13. With the resources that YouTube has at its disposal, Exactly how hard can it be for them to figure out that an account that spends 100% of its time watching Fortnite videos and Nickelodeon uploads probably doesn't belong to a retired 64-year-old mechanical engineer from Wisconsin? Identify YouTube accounts that have clearly been created fraudulently by children too young to be watching videos on YouTube, disable targeted advertising on those accounts, and restrict those accounts to the kind of content that is appropriate for their age bracket. Now, I have no doubt that they would still manage to fuck this up and get it wrong occasionally, but they'd get it right a lot more than they would get it wrong. And even if they did get it wrong, just prove your age. If you are of an appropriate age, it's not difficult to prove it. So YouTube could either stop running adverts for My Little Fucking Pony and Hello Kitty online, but they're not doing that. They're still accepting money from people advertising things like that, things that are clearly aimed at young children, because YouTube's making money out of that. Or, and it's clearly within their power to do so, identify those accounts that obviously belong to people who are too young to be on YouTube in the first place, and either shut those accounts down or restrict the content that is available to them and the advertising that is available to them. But they're not doing that either. So if they could kick every 12-year-old and younger off YouTube tomorrow, but they're not doing that, and they could stop taking money from advertisers who are running adverts selling products that are clearly aimed at children 12 years age or under, but they're not doing that either. They're still taking money from advertisers running adverts that are targeted towards underage children. And they're still entirely happy to allow underage children to have YouTube accounts where they can watch those adverts and other age-inappropriate material. YouTube could easily make this entire problem go away by implementing one or both, preferably, of those two solutions, but they're choosing not to do it. They're deliberately choosing not to do this. And instead, their solution is their infamously shitty algorithm that's famous for getting it wrong and causing so much pain and grief. The algorithm that the Federal Trade Commission themselves recommended against because they said it would be a half-hearted measure that would technically comply with the order and give the public a false sense of security. An algorithm that they said would likely catch in its net channels not directed at children, therefore limiting content to other audiences while the errors are resolved. Why would they do this? Instead of using any of the other measures that I've just described that would fix the problem and that are within YouTube's power to do. Well, I'm going to give you the summary from Folding Ideas video on this subject. Again, link in the video description because I 100% agree with his conclusion, and he says it far better than I ever could. YouTube wants a scenario where they're still allowed to gather and utilize children's data in serving targeted behavioral ads, with the blame falling on channel owners for allowing them to gather that information and serve those ads. This is what it's like to be a YouTuber these days. YouTube is technically, I can't say I'm their employee, they don't like that, because then they would be legally required to actually give a shit about me. This is my business partner, YouTube, a business partner that I am 100% reliant on for my income, and from one month to the next I don't actually know how much I'm going to be paid by my business partner. Maybe it'll be enough to pay the bills, and maybe it won't. I'll just have to wait and see from one month to the next. And while I'm pretty much allowed to just work at whatever it is that I want to do, which is pretty nice, I don't actually know specifically what it is that I do that's earning the money, because YouTube won't tell me. When I do something that they don't like, they're very quick to tell me about it, but they don't tell me specifically what it was that I did that they don't like. They just stop paying me. I only find out about it afterwards. I can protest about it, but it takes so long to get their attention that it's too late and the damage is done. And when the shit really hits the fan, when YouTube get caught out doing really objectionable stuff, running adverts on the kind of content that advertisers are absolutely horrified to be associated with, or targeting behavioral advertising towards children who are supposed to be too young to have YouTube accounts in the first place, I am the first person that YouTube throws under the bus. Picture yourself in that kind of working environment, because that's what it's like being a YouTuber these days, and it has been for quite some time. It's getting to the stage now where I don't even know if I'm still going to be doing this a year from now. I mean, I'd like to be, because despite all of the shit that goes with it, There are worse jobs to have. I mean, I get to work from home. I can pretty much run my own schedule. There's a certain amount of work that has to get done each day, but how and when I do it is pretty much left up to me. And yet at the same time, if I produce content that's directed towards a mature audience, it's flagged as being not suitable for most advertisers. And so, boom, there goes a lot of your advertising revenue. And if I do content that's directed towards children, it's not suitable for any advertisers. So, not only boom, there goes your advertising revenue, but there goes all of your engagement. Nobody can like your videos, nobody can leave comments on your videos, nobody can share your videos. You're basically fucked. So what if you make the decision, as a lot of other YouTube channels have done, YouTube channels that I'm still subscribed to, channels like Forgotten Weapons, that just say fuck it. This whole YouTube thing is just too much of a minefield. You don't know what you're doing wrong until after it's happened, at which point it's too late. So just demonetize the channel entirely. No advertising, no revenue from YouTube whatsoever, and instead you just rely 100% on things like Patreon supporters and sponsored videos. It seems like a perfectly reasonable response to the situation that YouTube finds itself in these days. Except, in addition to all of the other shit, YouTube have just updated their terms of service for 2019. And if you dig deep enough into YouTube's new terms of service, you'll find the following paragraph. Terminations by YouTube for service changes. YouTube may terminate your access or your Google account's access to all or parts of the service if YouTube believes in its sole discretion that provision of the service to you is no longer commercially viable. Understandably, many YouTubers completely lost their shit at this extremely vaguely worded implied threat that if you weren't making enough money for YouTube, they were going to cancel your Google account entirely. This is how people interpreted that statement, because that's what the statement says. YouTube, however, were very quick to respond with a clarification. Across social media, YouTube comment sections, they consistently came up with the following response. To clarify, the commercially viable section is not about terminating an account because it's not making money. It's about discontinuing certain features or parts of the service because they're outdated or they have low usage. This does not impact creators or viewers in new ways. Now, while I'm obviously grateful for YouTube for issuing this clarification, I can't help but notice that they haven't amended the terms of service to reflect the clarification that they issued on social media. You see, here's the thing. YouTube can issue any number of tweets claiming that that's not what they meant to say. But the simple fact remains that until they revise the terms of service again to take into account what they actually meant to say, they're still saying that they reserve the right to shut down your YouTube channel whenever they feel like it. And not just your YouTube channel, your entire Google account. Whenever they feel like it, should you no longer be commercially viable. This has always been YouTube's problem. They issue vague statements like this that can be interpreted any number of different ways. We reserve the right to limit advertising on your videos if we determine that you are not suitable for most advertisers. Oh, okay, well, what is suitable for most advertisers? Yeah, guess. Oh, yeah, we're going to shut off 90% of your advertising revenue, prevent people from making comments on your videos, prevent people from sharing your videos, and all kinds of other bad shit. Because of something that we did, by the way. We fucked up, but you're the one who's getting thrown under the bus for it. If we determine that the content that you upload is suitable for children. Okay, well, I think we can all agree that advertising to children is a bad thing, so how do we know what you consider to be kids' stuff? Oh, you know, things that kids like. Well, no, I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. What, by your definition, is children's content? Yeah, we have a definition. I know you have a definition. I want to know what the definition is. We're not prepared to disclose that. Are you fucking serious? Yes, we are. Oh, and that bit in our terms of service where we said that we would terminate your entire Google account, including your YouTube channel, if we, at our sole discretion, determined that it was no longer commercially viable for us to support you. That's not what we meant to say. You'll be fine. Alright, so you're going to change the terms of service? No, we're happy with the wording as it is. But trust us, that's not what we meant to say. You'll be fine, trust us. When have we ever lied to you before? You know what, Google? Fuck you. Fuck you and the horse you rode in on. I'll tell you, I cannot wait for the moment when there's a commercially viable competitor to YouTube available, because I would jump ship in a fucking heartbeat. Realistically, I don't expect it's ever going to happen. I mean, who's going to have the resources to pull it off? Microsoft? Maybe. Twitch? Possibly. But the more shit YouTube gets into, the less appealing the market is looking to any potential competitors. So, realistically speaking, I think we're stuck with YouTube for the foreseeable future. Still, things can't get any worse, eh? Anybody who tells you things can't get any worse on YouTube simply lacks sufficient imagination. Anyway, that's enough about our evil corporate overlords. We're not quite done with this episode of Mingles with Jingles. I also wanted to discuss an issue that I've been thinking about quite a bit, actually, since last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. And it's to do with AI in games, and also to do with world building in games. Related to what I spoke about last week, about people who don't really play games much, being exposed to games and trying to do things that seem perfectly logical, but running up against the brick wall where the developers hadn't even contemplated that somebody might want to try doing that, because that's just not how games work. Gamers don't expect to be able to do that sort of thing, so no consideration had been made for somebody trying it. The thing that I love about a game like Red Dead Redemption 2 is that most of the time, if I want to try doing something, the game doesn't stop me. And if I can't do something, it's not because I've run into the old invisible wall, it's because my character wouldn't be capable of physically doing it. If I decide I want to swim across the lake in Saint Denis, I'm welcome to try. But Arthur's not a particularly good swimmer, so he'll run out of stamina and drown before I make it to the other side. I could get into a boat and paddle across, that's no problem. But my character wouldn't be able to swim it, because my character wouldn't be able to swim it. It's like climbing a mountain. There might look like there's something interesting at the top, and it may be that there's actually a route, or if you're American, a route, to the top of the mountain that I just haven't found yet. But Arthur can't just climb the mountain wall, because he's not a mountaineer. He's wearing completely unsuitable footwear. I mean, you don't climb mountains wearing cowboy boots. And he just doesn't have the kind of experience that would be necessary to successfully scale a sheer cliff face. I am welcome to try. The game doesn't stop you from trying, but the results are likely to be fatal, which is exactly as it should be. And that's in quite stark contrast to another game that I've been playing quite a bit recently, which I actually really like. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, where you can do a lot of things that you would expect to be able to do, like deflect blaster bolts fired by stormtroopers and use the force to lift things and push things and pull things and throw things, but there are all kinds of other things that you would very reasonably be expect to be able to do if you're armed with a lightsaber that you just can't. And you just can't because, well, the only real reason I can think of is because the developers were just kind of lazy. I understand that when I'm running around the various different planets, and the levels are very, very intricately designed as far as their geometry is concerned, and I understand that there are certain routes that I have to take through the levels because that's the way the game's been designed, and finding the shortcuts through the levels that allow you to quickly and easily backtrack through the levels is part of the game design. That I don't have a problem with. In fact, I think that's actually one of the game's strong points. But, well, quite often you'll come across things that just don't make any sense whatsoever. You're on the planet Dathomir, for example, which is very dry and rocky, and I can quite clearly see a gap between two rock cliff walls. And where I need to be is right through that gap. And the only thing that's blocking that gap are a couple of pieces of rickety wooden planks that appear to have been tied together with bits of vine. And I can't jump over this makeshift wooden fence, even though it's only about 4 feet tall, and even though using the force I can easily jump obstacles 10 feet high, and I can't cut through these rickety wooden planks with my lightsaber because reasons. Now, all of this could have easily been avoided if they hadn't put that gap there in the first place. Just make it a solid rock wall, or they blocked that gap with something that I wouldn't expect to be able to jump over and wouldn't expect to be able to cut through with a lightsaber. But they didn't. Somebody, somewhere along the line, decided it would be a great idea to put a gap in the level through which I could clearly see the objective of the level and block that gap with something that I could reasonably be expected to either jump over or cut through, but deny me the option of doing either of those things. Why? On what level does that make any kind of sense? I mentioned last week that I kept coming across sealed doors that I also couldn't cut through with my lightsaber, and I understand why from a game design perspective. It's because that's not the way you're supposed to defeat the level. You're supposed to find the secret way past. I get it. But at the same time, I'm a fucking Jedi. Right? I've got a lightsaber. And only a lightsaber. More on that in a moment. I've seen Jedi cutting through doors with lightsabers. Why can't I do that here? And somebody said in the comments, actually, Jingles, the doors are made from cortosis. It's a lightsaber-resistant material. You don't know that the doors are made of cortosis. I can just as easily say, no, they're not. They're made of durasteel. And I'm probably going to be more right than you are, and I'll tell you why. Cortosis is an incredibly rare, fragile, and expensive material. You're not going to make the doors in your facility out of cortosis on the off chance that maybe one day a Jedi is going to come along and try to cut their way through them with a lightsaber, because it's way too expensive and the doors would be useless for stopping anything else. You could kick them down, right? Blast through them with a blaster. Cortosis is only good at resisting lightsabers. It's shit for every other purpose. So no, of course the doors aren't made of cortosis. And of course the only reason I can't cut through them with a lightsaber is because that's not the way the level was designed. But I can't help but think that even from a purely game design perspective, there may have been another way of doing it that didn't raise these questions in the first place. And then of course, I mentioned that I have a lightsaber and only a lightsaber, when having a blaster pistol in this game would be incredibly useful on a number of different occasions. And there's no reason whatsoever why the character cannot pick up a blaster. God knows you slaughter enough stormtroopers that there are just dozens of blasters lying around the levels. But you're not allowed to pick up a blaster, even though having one would be so incredibly useful, because you're supposed to figure out the puzzles in order to progress through the level using just the Force and just your lightsaber. I'm not saying it's a bad game. I have really been enjoying it. But nobody's ever going to be able to point to Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and say with a straight face that the game is a shining example of believable world building. And then, of course, if we're talking about believable world building, I'm going to break with tradition in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, and instead of kicking Bethesda for Fallout 76, even though they richly deserve it, you can never give them enough shit for Fallout 76, I'm going to sing Bethesda's praises. Because in Oblivion, Skyrim, and to some degree in Fallout 4 as well, they absolutely nailed it. I'm talking here about their Radiant AI system. They called it AI. It wasn't really artificial intelligence, obviously. We're never going to have to worry about any of the characters from Skyrim breaking out onto the internet and taking control over the world's nuclear arsenals. But that's just what they called it. And it really was a work of genius. You see, kids, I'm going to have to get my soapbox out now. Way back in the day, in these computer games, if I wanted to go to a non-player character shopkeeper in order to sell my loot, he was always just there, standing in his shop, just waiting for me to turn up and sell him stuff. Eventually, some game developers thought, this isn't particularly realistic. I mean, doesn't this guy ever sleep? What does he do when he's not in the shop? And so they would add scripts to the non-player characters, so that at a certain time they would go to bed, and at a certain time they would wake up, and at a certain time they would go to work, and so on and so on and so on. And I can't remember the first time I actually experienced non-player characters doing this in a game. It may have been one of the Elder Scrolls games. I really can't remember. But it made things both a lot more frustrating, because it meant I couldn't just turn up at the shop any time of the day to sell my loot. I had to wait until the shop was open. But it also made things a lot more believable and realistic. Well, in the Elder Scrolls Oblivion, they didn't bother with something as simple as scripted responses for non-player characters. What the Radiant AI system did was to basically give every non-player character a certain set of goals and needs, and then it would determine, using a system that I think was called responsibility, how the non-player characters would go about satisfying those needs and goals, and then it just let them get on with it. So all of the non-player characters would basically have a bunch of daily goals that they had to achieve, and that might be something as simple as be at your shop by 8 o'clock in the morning in order to open up and be ready for business. If you were a blacksmith, your daily goals might be make this many iron swords, or however many of whatever weapons and equipment were required to maintain the blacksmith's shop's stock levels. And they would just be left to their own devices to achieve those goals. So in the example of the blacksmith, for example, let's say his or her goal is to make 15 iron swords and 15 iron shields every day for their shop. And this is fine, and they'll keep doing this every day until they run out of iron ore, at which point they get a new goal: get more iron ore. Now, depending on the responsibility level of that particular blacksmith, they might go about that in any number of different ways. If they have high responsibility and sales have been good, so they've got a lot of cash, they can just go to a merchant who sells iron ore, buy some, and take it straight back to the shop. Now, if they didn't have enough money to buy the iron ore that they needed, but they did have a high responsibility stat, they might instead go back to the store, grab a pickaxe, head out of town into the hills, find an iron ore mine, and dig up the iron ore that they needed. And while that was going on, while they were away from their store during the working day, their wife or their apprentice, who up until that point, during the normal course of events, would have had the goals keep the furnace stoked or ensure that lunch is prepared, another goal would have activated for them, which would have been to man the shop while the blacksmith is away fetching iron ore, so that you, the player, had somebody to actually interact with when you turned up at the blacksmith shop. Now, if that blacksmith didn't have particularly high responsibility, they've still got the goal to make 15 iron swords and 15 iron shields, and failing that, the new goal to get enough iron ore to do that. But they did have money, they might still go to the merchant and attempt to buy the iron ore that they need. But if they didn't have the money that they needed, and they didn't have a very high responsibility, they probably wouldn't try to obtain the iron ore legitimately by going out into the hills and mining it. Instead, they would try to steal it. And they might get caught. And because they don't have any money, otherwise they wouldn't have needed to steal it in the first place, they would get executed by the town guards because they would be unable to pay the fine for stealing the ore from the merchant. And all of this stuff was just happening around you, whether you were paying attention to it or not. Of course, it didn't take long before players realised they could take advantage of these emergent behaviours, and they were encouraged to do so. We're talking about the kind of things that in most other games would be considered exploits, but were perfectly valid responses to problems in Oblivion, Skyrim and Fallout 4. Let us say, for example, you wanted to kill somebody, but you didn't want to get caught. You couldn't take the risk of getting caught. There could be no evidence implicating you. What you could do, and what several people did do, was to sneak into your victim's house, either while they were asleep or when they were out of the house at work. Go through the house and steal every piece of food, and then leave a single poisoned apple in a fruit bowl on a table in the middle of the living room. Because when that non-player character came back to their house, they were going to be hungry, and they would look through the house for the first piece of food that they could find to satisfy their goal, which was to eat at 6 p.m. And if the only piece of food in the house was your poisoned apple, they would eat it, and it would kill them, and you would have successfully assassinated them without having laid a single finger on them. In a way, this whole Radiant AI system was actually born out of necessity, because up until then, the behaviour of non-player characters had been determined by these scripts. But Oblivion and Skyrim and Fallout 4 were so massively huge, with so many non-player characters, it would have been prohibitively expensive in time and resources for the developers to write specific scripts for every single non-player character in the game. So they kind of had to turn to some kind of goal-based AI system, and that's what led to the development of Radiant. And it was a genius system. I mean, it wasn't without its problems, of course. When they were testing the system in various different games, they kept running into situations that they just hadn't been able to predict would happen. For example, in the Elder Scrolls games, there's a drug, a very addictive drug called skooma. And as you'd probably expect, skooma addicts don't have particularly high responsibility stats, otherwise they wouldn't be skooma addicts in the first place. And they kept finding that there was a skooma dealer who was quite critical to one of the main quests in whichever one of the games it was. But nobody could ever find him alive. He was always dead. Anytime they came across the spot where the player was supposed to meet this guy to continue the quest, he was lying there dead, stabbed to death in the middle of a graveyard. Now, the graveyard was where he hung out to deal skooma. And the thing about the skooma addicts was they basically only ever had one goal: get more skooma, because they're addicts. Once they ran out of money, which didn't take very long because their only job was taking skooma, and they had such a low responsibility score, they wouldn't just go and get a job and earn the money that they needed to buy skooma from him. They would just stab him to death and steal the skooma from his body. And this is why this particular character was constantly dead anytime anybody ever tried to find him. So there were certain aspects of the system that kind of had to be toned down a bit. But overall, it was a remarkable system that did an excellent job. And it wasn't even the first game to use a system like this, although it tends to get the credit for it. And, well, it does deserve credit because it was an extremely well-polished version of a sort of goal-based artificial intelligence game system. But the Radiant AI system first debuted in The Elder Scrolls Oblivion in 2006. And Hideo Kojima had already been doing something extremely similar 2 years earlier in Metal Gear Solid 3. MGS3 had a food system. A lot of games have food systems, where your health and stamina is replenished when you eat food. What was unusual about Metal Gear Solid 3 was that the character that you played, Snake, there were certain foods that he liked and certain foods that he didn't. And you would know that he didn't like a certain food because he'd tell you, and when he ate it, he wouldn't get back as much health or stamina. There was no nutritional reason for this whatsoever. I mean, one food had as much nutritional value as another food, but Snake didn't like the flavour of that food or the taste of that food, so he didn't get as much benefit from eating it. But if that's the only food that he had, he would still eat it. And if he kept eating that food because you never had anything else to give him, he would start to get used to it. And he would start to get more health and stamina back from eating it. And the reverse was true of foods that he really liked. I mean, I love cheese, but I can't eat cheese all day because I start to get sick of it. I'm like, for God's sake, give me some meat, give me some fish, whatever. And it was the same for Snake. If there was a food that he particularly liked, he would get back much more health and stamina from eating it. But if that's all that you gave him to eat, he would start to get sick of it and would start to gain less health and stamina from eating that particular food. And food didn't last either. It would go off. And it would go off at realistic rates. Cheese, for example, would keep for a couple of days, at least. Fish, not so much. If you caught a fish and killed it and cooked it, if you didn't eat it that same day, it would probably start to go rotten. But this is where the whole emergent AI of the NPCs comes into play, because the guards and the enemies had to eat as well. And so, what you could do, and nobody told you to do this, by the way, this is just one of the things that people discovered from playing the game. It's one of the reasons why Hideo Kojima is such a respected game developer. What you could do in Metal Gear Solid 3 was sneak around a level, destroying all of the food stores, so that the guards got hungry. Because when they were hungry, they were easier to defeat. They didn't have as much health, they didn't have as much stamina, it was easier to knock them out, for example. But what you could also do, and again, nobody told you to do this, it's just something that people figured out, was to take this rotten fish that's been sitting in your pocket for the last 3 days and just leave it on the floor. So these hungry guards would be wandering around on their patrol paths, starving, see some fish on the floor, pick it up and eat it, and immediately start suffering from food poisoning. So they were weak to begin with because they hadn't had anything to eat, because you destroyed all of the food stores, and now they were even weaker and even easier to defeat because you'd food poisoned them. They really don't seem to make games like that anymore, which is a real shame. In fact, they definitely don't make games like that anymore in the case of Bethesda, which is kind of bizarre. I mean, that Radiant system was a work of genius, and it made Oblivion, Fallout 4 and Skyrim the games that they are. Well, to be fair, it was one of many great features that went into those games that made them as good as they were, and so it's no surprise whatsoever that without all of those features, Fallout 76 is as bad as it is. Oh, Jingles. Jingles, Jingles, Jingles. You almost made it. You almost made it through an entire episode of Mingles with Jingles without giving shit to Fallout 76. So close, but so far. I know. It's getting to the point now where I feel like I'm contractually obliged to give Fallout 76 a savage kicking at every possible opportunity. Tell you what, as long as Fallout 76 doesn't throw further fuel on the dumpster fire that is Fallout 76 between now and next week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, I promise that I won't mention Fallout 76 in next week's episode. How does that sound? Does that sound fair? Because let's face it, you know, if they ask for it, I have to do it. But if they don't do anything between now and next week, if they can manage a week without fucking up, okay, I won't mention Fallout 76 in next week's episode. We got a deal? Okay, good. Right. I'm going to have to shut up and leave now, otherwise I'll be in violation of one of the things that I said right at the beginning of this episode, in that this week's episode wasn't going to be as long as last week's episode. So, on that bombshell, I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you all had a great weekend, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.